Okay, let's go back to our discussion. So, as I have mentioned, or as I've said kanina, that a change in the price of a good alters the slope of the budget constraint. It also changes the MRS at the consumer's utility maximizing choices. Then, when the price changes, two effects come into play: the substitution effect and income effect. Substitution effect means that um, if the price of the good, or if one of the prices of one of the goods price changes, then the tendency of the consumer is to substitute, or to substitute his or her consumption on a certain good for the other. So, for example, between goods X and Y, if the price of good Y increases, then um, he may choose to buy less on good Y and purchase more on good X. And take note, the only way for the consumer to increase the consumption of good X um, is by decreasing the consumption of good Y. And in order for him or her to be on the same indifference curve. So that's substitution effect. The idea of substitution effect. Thus, the consumer substitutes X for Y because X now or Y now. The consumer substitutes Y for X because Y now is more expensive. So, substitution effect. The income effect naman, it is the price change alters the individual's real income, and therefore, he must move to a new indifference curve. Kumbaga, sa income effect, as price of Y increases, so ano yung effect niya to your limited income? Diba? If you have an income of 200, tapos biglang tumaas yung price ng good Y from 10 nagiging 15. So, the effect is that you are now poorer than you were before. Or ibig sabihin, your purchasing power, or yun yung tinatawag na real income, is now lesser your 200 na income. The purchasing power of, diba, or your real income, or yung 200 mo na income, yung 200 mo na income can now buy fewer quantity of good Y, because Y is now more expensive. So again, income effect, as price of one good, or as price of good Y increases, then the consumers, or the real income of the consumer, or kumbaga yung purchasing power of the consumer is now lesser. So therefore, he can now buy lesser quantity of X than Y. Lesser quantity of Y, because Y is more expensive. Okay, so that is income effect. Okay, suppose Okay, let's illustrate now the two effects. Illustrate the substitution and income effects. Okay, suppose the consumer is maximizing utility at point A. So point A is the optimum point, or the utility maximizing point, because the budget line and the indifference curve ay tangent. So the situation is that if the price of good X falls, so the price of good X bumaba, so what will happen to the budget line? From the initial budget line na ito siya, di ba? The budget line can either shift or rotate, di ba? So rotate siya if the prices of the goods nag-change. Then it will shift if the income of the consumer changes. So if the price of good X falls, then the consumer will maximize utility at point B. So the decline in the price of good X is represented the by the rotation of the budget line to the right, di ba? Ito yung initial budget line. Then, as price of X decreases, so the budget line now rotates to the right. So, rotation of the budget line. And hypothetically, the new maximum, the new optimum point is at point B. So, from point A, the new maximum point is at point B. So, the quantity of, what happens to the quantity of X, diba? Since the price of X now decreases, then by substitution effect, anong mangyari? The consumer will buy more X because mura ngayon si X. So by substitution effect, consumer will buy more X. Then, by income effect, anong mangyari? The consumer, since good X is now cheaper, then the purchasing power or the real income of the consumer is now higher. Okay, the purchasing power of the consumer is now higher. So, kaya, the quantity of good X further increases. So, again, if we decompose the two effects, by substitution effect, tumaas yung quantity of X. And by income effect, tumaas din yung quantity of good X as the price of good X falls. So, the total increase in X is equal to this diagram, this area. So, from point A, if merong value dyan, if we can exactly solve for the value or ilan yung in-increase na quantity in good X. So, it is equal to this area from here to here. So, that's the total increase in X. Total increase, so ibig sabihin the total effect is equal to this income effect plus the substitution effect. So, all in all, the new optimum point is at point B. Now, let us decompose the two effects of a price change. Again, we will assume that the price of good X falls. So here we will identify the substitution and income effects as price of good X falls. So to isolate the substitution effect, so we will identify here We will identify first the substitution effect. So to isolate the substitution effect, we hold real income constant but allow the relative price of good X to change. So again, our assumption here is that the price of good X falls. So it is represented by the rotation of the budget line. So as we can see in the budget line rotates to the right. So initially from our earlier discussion, so the initial optimum point or the initial optimum bundle of X and Y for a consumer is at point B. So that is, ibig sabihin that is before the price of good X falls. So since the price of good X or since good X now is cheaper, so there's a tendency of the consumer to substitute or to consume more X rather than good Y. So from point A, the consumer will now purchase or will choose bundle C, for example. So we'll denote that as bundle C. So from point A to point C, the quantity of good X at the new bundle is now higher compared at point A. So this is now what we call the substitution effect. So since good X is now cheaper, then consumer buys more units of good X. But take note at point C, that combination of X and Y lies on the same indifference curve as point A. So that means that at point C or at point A, the level of utility of the consumer is the same. So, walang nawalang or hindi nag-decrease yung satisfaction of the consumer as he or she expands or increase his or her consumption on good X. Because again, at point C, although the quantity of good X increases, the quantity of good Y naman ay bumaba. So, kung ano yung the happiness that a consumer gets from purchasing more X is equal to the foregone happiness that he derived from purchasing less on good Y. So the same level of utility. So again, the movement from point A to C is called the substitution effect. So from A to C is called the substitution effect. So here, the individual or the consumer substitutes good X for good Y because it is now relatively cheaper. Okay, how about the income effect? The income effect occurs because the individual's real income or purchasing power changes when the price of good X falls. So, because good X is now cheaper, then the real income of the consumer increases, or consumer now can buy more quantity of good X because its price decreases. So along the new budget line, okay, we can create a hypothetical new optimum point, right? So let's say point B, point B. So point B is the new optimum point as price of good X decreases. And saan dyan yung, or how can we illustrate the income effect? Okay, since good X now is cheaper, then the tendency of the consumer is to buy more units of good X. So from point C, okay, from the lower indifference curve, which is U1, the new bundle, the new combination now is at point B, which is at the higher indifference curve. And at point B, the indifference curve U2 and the budget line are tangent. And notice also that we have here a broken line, the violet colored broken line. This is being illustrated to show that at point C, merong parang temporary na optimum point, kumbaga, or imaginary na optimum point as price of good X falls. So, we illustrate also a broken or an imaginary budget line. And notice that this violet colored budget line is parallel to the new budget line, right? As price of good X declines. So, parallel siya. So, parang nag-shift yung from the imaginary budget line or from this broken line to the new budget line. Parang nag-shift, yung effect ay parang nag-shift yung budget line. And again, that is because the real income or the purchasing power of the consumer changes. So the budget line at point B, ito siya, di ba? Ito yung budget line. This is the budget line as the price of good X falls. So it rotates. So nag-rotate siya from the initial budget line na ito. And itong function ni broken line, okay, so we have constructed this broken line to show that there is an imaginary or a temporary optimum point or optimum combination na nangyari as price of good X falls. So again, at point C, that's a temporary or optimum initial optimum as price of good X falls. So, yun. So, the movement from point C naman to point B shows that the quantity of good X further increases, right? So, from point A to C kanina, by substitution effect, the quantity or unit of good X increases. Then, by income effect, the movement from point C to point B, the quantity of X further increases. So, that's the income effect. So, all in all, again, the total effect is from point A to point B. That's the total effect. So, substitution effect plus income effect. So, that is the total effect for good X as its price changes. So we can say that in this situation, good X is a normal good. Kasi nga, as its price decreases, so the real income or the purchasing power of the consumer also increases and consumer buys more X. So, more X, more units of good X. So here, good X is a normal good. Okay, another diagram. Another situation, we assume that the price of good X now increases. The price of good X increases. Mangyari or the budget constraint. So, halimbawa ito yung initial budget line. And the initial optimum point is at point A. It is where the initial budget line and the initial indifference curve are tangent. So, as price of good X increases, then the new budget line now rotates to the left. Okay, so the new budget line rotates to the left. Or here, the budget line gets steeper siya. So the movement from point A to point B, so B here is the new optimum point, right? B is the new optimum combination as price of good X increases. So the movement from point A to point B is called the total effect. But the total effect of X as its price increases. So, anong nangyari sa quantity of X? Bumaba from here. So, nag-decrease yung quantity of X. But if we want to decompose the two effects, so i-identify natin saan si income effect and substitution effect. So again, from point A is the initial budget line, initial optimum point. Since the price of good X now is expensive, then the consumer will substitute, diba? Or will buy more Y instead of X. So the new or the temporary or by substitution effect, the new bundle for X and Y is at point C. And again, point C or point A gives the same satisfaction of the consumer because they lie on the same indifference curve. So the movement from point A to point C is called the substitution effect. And at point C, again, we will construct an imaginary budget line which is tangent sa U1, which tangent sa indifference curve U1. And since the price of good X now is higher, again, the purchasing power of the consumer declines. So as a result, so parang ang effect niya ay mas poorer or mas mahirap ngayon si consumer compare nung hindi pa nagtaas yung price ng good X. So as a result, from point C, the quantity of good X further decreases to, let's say, for example, point B. So, point B. So again, the movement from point C to point B is called the income effect. C to B is income effects. So Yun, if we will, or if we want to identify or decompose the substitution and income effect. So the total, again, the total effect is from point A to point B. So all in all, ano yung effect niya? Its quantity also declines. So we can conclude here again that good X is a normal good because as purchasing power of the consumer declines, the quantity of good X also declines. So good X here is a normal good. Okay, clarification. Okay, what about if the price of good Y now declines, but no changes in the price of good X? Okay, can you illustrate the situation if the price of good Y, so doon tayo kay good Y, mag-analyze. What will happen to the quantity of good Y if its price declines? And also, can you identify the substitution and income effect? So you can try doing that, okay, in your own. Okay, so after watching this video, you can practice analyzing or illustrating the situation if what will happen if the price of good Y changes. Okay, so yun. So if a good is normal, so ano yung idea na nakuha natin? If a good is normal, substitution and income effects reinforce one another. So if a good is normal daw, then the direction of substitution and income effects are the same, or they reinforce one another. So when price falls, both effects lead to a rise in quantity demanded. And when price rises, both effects lead to a drop in quantity demanded. So yun yung nangyari kay good X. What about if the good is not a normal good? So if a good is inferior, di ba? There are two types of goods, normal and inferior. So if a good is inferior, then substitution and income effects move in opposite directions. So, for example, if a good is inferior, then if the price of good X falls, then by substitution effect, or the substitution effect leads to pwedeng tumaas yung quantity of good X, and by income effect bumaba yung quantity of good X. So opposite yung direction. So the combined effect, if the good is inferior, the combined effect is indeterminate. Okay? Indeterminate, ibig sabihin, when price rises, the substitution effect leads to a drop in quantity demanded, but the income effect is opposite. Or when price falls, the substitution effect leads to a rise in quantity demanded, but the income effect is opposite. So, yun yung sinabi ko kanina. So indeterminate yung, ibig sabihin ng indeterminate, it is difficult to determine if ano yung total effect. If the good is inferior, then the price of that good decreases. What will happen to its quantity demanded or quantity purchased by the consumer? Tumaas ba or lumiit? So, ano yung net effect, kumbaga, or total effect? So, we cannot say, or it is difficult to determine if, again, if the good is inferior. But unlike kay normal good na okay, the same direction, si substitution and income effect, then we can determine kung anong nangyari sa quantity purchase of the consumer of a certain good. Okay, so yun yung kaibahan ni inferior and normal goods. Another type of a good is the given good. So the term given good was named after Robert Giffen. So sa kanya ipinangalan, Giffen is an economist, naka-observe na that there is a certain type of good na di ba normally if the price of a product is higher, then it follows that consumer will buy less of the product. Or if good X, or if the price of a certain product is lower, then consumer will buy more on that good. Right? So, but in Giffen's observation, sometimes consumer will not behave that way, but the opposite. Ibig sabihin, although tumaas or although mahal yung product, still consumer buys more of that product. And that is called Giffen's paradox. So, what is a Giffen's paradox? So, in the case of a given good, if the income effect of a price change is strong enough, then there could be a positive relationship between price and quantity demanded. So, again, yung sabi ko kanina, normally, or yung ideal relationship, or ano yung sabi sa law of demand. So, next chapter we'll discuss about demand. But, okay, the ideal behavior of the consumer is that if mahal yung isang product, then the tendency of the consumer is to buy less of that product. So, there is a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. But in the case of a given good, there's the relationship between price and quantity demanded is positive. Ibig sabihin, as price of good X, for example, increases, then still consumer buys more of that good. So the quantity demanded also increases. So anong nangyari? Because the income effect, okay, the income effect as the price of that good, halimbawa good X changes, is strong enough to cancel the substitution effect. Nagets nyo? So, kaya nangyari yung Giffen's paradox. So, mas malaki yung income effect. So, na-capture or na-cancel out nung, halimbawa, tumaas yung good X, price of good X tumaas. So, ano mangyari? Then, by substitution effect, consumer will buy less X but more Y. Diba? Nag-substitute siya. But by income effect, ano yung income effect? If the price of good X will change, price of good X increases, diba yung real income bumaba. The result or the situation is that as real income or as purchasing power of the consumer decreases, then consumer buys more of that good. So na-cancel out yung substitution effect na the consumer buys less on good X. But by income effect, the consumer of that buys more of that goods. So, ibig sabihin, si given good, isang property or isang characteristic ni given good is siya ay inferior good. So, inferior good. So, as real income decreases, consumer buys more of that good. So, an increase in price leads to a drop in real income. And since the good is inferior, a drop in income causes quantity demanded to rise. So, the income effect for a given good is greater than the substitution effect. Okay, so yun yung special type of a good. Okay, so summary na. Next is summary of this chapter. So I want you to internalize or study or read this part na on your own. I will not discuss this one anymore. So more or less ito yung summary of the whole chapter. Important points to note. Okay, so I hope you learned something about the consumer behavior or yes, the we as consumer, ano yung behavior natin, okay, before we buy goods and services. So our next topic is about demand and supply. So demand and supply is more or less connected to this topic, especially demand. The demand or law of demand is connected or extension siya of the consumer theory.